Many of you here will know Hazel. She's been a dear friend of mine for many years. I've been coming up and visiting her, and I'll go from here to there. And I suppose if it's possible to dedicate a lecture to somebody, I'll dedicate this one to Hazel, because she was the one that instigated it. And you know, it's been a long and cherished friendship with her. She's a very special person, not just to me, but to a lot of people. So everything that John said about my past life, well, he got that bit right. So all that writing about horticulture, first of all it was about foreign aid, and then I changed into horticulture, and all of that's quite irrelevant to why I'm writing about islands, or why I've come to write about islands. And just before I start, I'll just say is that I'm sorry the pointer doesn't seem to like this television set, so when I want to point out things, it works on, it just goes all around, it won't go onto that. It won't go onto that in show, so we have to do without the pointer. My apologies for that. Okay, so I am almost at the end. They're the last few books I've got to sell. I self-published the book and I've self-marketed it, and I'm sort of almost beyond exhaustion. I don't recommend self-publication as a way to go to people. Except that I got the book I wanted, which I might not have done if I'd gone through a publisher. They might have had their own way. But anyway, so it's been a long island obsessed journey. Almost 5 years since I started the project, which took about 3.5 years, leading walks and paddles to, around, or past every island. Then about 18 months writing and editing the book and designing the book, and then probably 3 months while it was at the printer, and since it arrived in Australia from China, promoting it. Whereas my biggest concern, I mean it's been challenging, but I must say, whereas my biggest concern a mere, 4 or 5 weeks ago when they arrived in Australia was that I might have books propping up my bed for the next 5 years, I'm now sold out. So it's been a pretty amazing response. And one of the most amazing things about it is that people that have responded and bought a book haven't just said, may I buy a book? I would say 70% have said, well, what a fabulous idea, or we love the concept, or we love the islands, we love our coast, this is going to help us explore it more. So, whereas one of my motivations for the book was to protect those islands because I thought they flew under the radar. People who aren't aware of, not many people could actually name more than a handful of islands on the south coast. It turns out there's a lot of love going for them, which has been really nice. And before I sort of get on to talking about them, there's probably a couple of more things that I should say. One is that all profits from the sales of the books are going to environmental projects, and you might wonder how I can self-publish a book and give money away. It's because I got 3 private donations, one very generous one and a couple of smaller ones, which covered, and I got a small Shoalhaven tourism grant. Hasn't covered the full cost of the book. I put in a bit of money with Mike. I'll tell you about Mike in a minute. We'll pay ourselves back from that little bit extra that all the other contributions didn't reach, and after that all the money will be given away to environmental projects. And secondly, I should say I didn't do it alone. I had a partner in this crime. His name's Mike Jeffers. He did the geology sections of the book, some of the bird sections, and the first draft of all the maps. They were his 3 areas of passion and expertise, which I certainly couldn't have done any of those. And he refused to be the co-author, but he does appear on the title page. It's a sort of convention in the way for copyright we had to do it. And so really, so Mike and I are both walks leaders for something called the National Parks Association Milton branch. I am also a member of the Illawarra Ramblers, and I do lead things for them, but it was with the NPA that this project started. And the NPA isn't the National Parks and Wildlife Service. The National Parks and Wildlife Service is the body that manages national parks. The NPA is a voluntary organisation, a conservation organisation that promotes issues in environmental issues, and their branches have activity programs, and Mike and I are both walks and paddle leaders for the Milton branch. So that's the preliminaries out of the way. So we should progress to talking about islands. Now, if you think these islands are palm-fringed islands where you sit and sip cocktails in the evening on a sandy beach and a coral reef, well, no, they're not. Nor are they international destinations like Fiji or Corfu or Sicily. We're talking about dots in the ocean here and local estuaries. Most of them are less than 10 hectares. You've probably never heard the names of many of them, and when I ask people how many they could name, people are lucky if they could name 6 or 7. But small and unknown as they are, there's something special about each of them. Several of them are wildlife havens with significant biodiversity values. Some have ancient and spiritual connections to Aboriginal people. Some have fascinating connections to explorers and settlers. And all of that is covered in the book, and obviously I can't cover a lot of that today. So I started off doing a little bit of research on each island while we were visiting them over the 4 or 5 years, but I discovered that with a very few exceptions, there were just no facts available. Nobody had ever written about the islands collectively, other than Barranguba, Montague Island and Vance Browley. There was very, very little information. Sometimes I'd get to, if you do a Google search and you get to page 3, you usually give up. Sometimes I'd get to page 10 and I might find a nugget, or then I'd give up, you know. And so that's why I started doing this research, and the result is the book 5 years later. I didn't know it was going to take so long. So it all started on a sunny Sunday back in December 2018, and Mike was leading a walk for our NPA Milton branch, and we were up on Wasp Head, where you could see 2 islands. That's Grasshopper Island, and that's Wasp Island. And everybody said, what's the name of those islands? Why are they nature reserves? What are they protecting? Who manages them? And I thought, every time we come here, everybody asks the same question. So I thought, you know, next time I'm going to do a bit of research and actually find some answers, and next time you come here, I'll just sound like a smarty pants. And that's how it began. That's all I was going to do, find out about a few islands. But once I started looking at islands, I found that there were quite a lot. There were 2 of 8 nature reserve islands on the south coast. So I began looking at what other islands there were, and ultimately we decided to start with Mike, and I got him to, because he likes looking at maps, we decided, well, let's look at all the islands that might exist between the Shoalhaven River at Nowra and the Victorian border. And I suppose at that stage I might have said we might find 20 or 30 islands, but I didn't think we'd find many more than that. But when we looked at maps, we started seeing an ever-increasing number. At one stage we got up to 63, and then we got down to 62, and then we got down to 61. Now, you might wonder how the number can go up and down. Well, after all, either's there or it isn't there. But it's not as simple as that. So, again, here I'm a bit hampered by not being able to make the pointer work. If you look at a map, or particularly if you look at Google Maps or Microsoft Maps or Apple Maps or anything other than 6 Maps, which is the official state mapping authority that does what used to be the old Ordnance Survey maps, you're likely to find the names of the islands wrongly named or not named at all. So if you look at that map, see the river, Shoalhaven River and then the Crookhaven River, and you see the big one where Tarara is marked? Again. Okay, so that's Pig Island, but there's no name on it, right? If you go along to the next one, that's Number Island, which is not named, and then next to it, you can see there is a Regatta Island, which isn't quite an island. You see that creek on the edge of it? That's actually an island, named as an island. Unfortunately, without the pointer, I can't show you exactly where I mean. But then, look at Currajong Island, and behind it, what do you see on the name behind it? Coolangatta! For heaven's sake, Coolangatta! Coolangatta's a mountain. This is another one of the Clayton's Islands. It's actually called Bevan's Island. Quite often you get things that were obviously once an island, but the river's been silted up with mangroves or whatever, and so they're no longer an island. But if they're named by the Geographical Names Board or on 6 maps, they qualify for inclusion. But if they're not named on either one of those, preferably both, but they don't always agree, then we didn't include them because there are actually quite a lot of unnamed islands, not in the ocean, but in the estuaries going down the coast. So that's why the numbers varied sometimes, because depending on which map you looked at and searched, you'd get a different answer. And there was one island, which I might mention later on, that we didn't even discover until 2 years down the track. I'll get on to that. So let's start with the coastal islands, first of all. So there are 20 coastal islands. These are all pretty close to the coastline, with the exception of Barranguga Montague, which is 9 kilometres offshore. Now, all these islands were part of the mainland until the last sea level rise about 6,000 years ago. So they're relatively low and rocky, many with sparsely vegetated central dome plateaus, and their vegetation usually reflects the vegetation on the nearby mainland. And they're often called Old Hat Islands because of the surrounding rock platform and the domed vegetation. This is Barling's Island down near Tonican, and it's a typical Old Hat Island. Now I already mentioned that there are 8 islands in a nature reserve. The one closest to you here, I mean there are, well, some of the islands in the Shoalhaven River, which I'll talk about, are nature reserves, but Bowen Island in Jervis Bay is a nature reserve. And nature reserves have a higher form of protection than national parks and wildlife. That's the national parks. They're usually managed by National Parks and Wildlife Service. They are all managed, but no one's allowed to land on them except for national park staff and visiting scientific researchers. So they have a higher form of protection. And these nature reserves protect breeding and that's not my phone, so I think I turned mine off.
Sorry.
The 8 nature reserve islands protect breeding and migratory seabirds, especially little penguins, but many others. There are little penguins on at least 5 or 6 of the islands, and I actually included quite a bit in the book about the little penguin life cycles and what is managed, how they're managed, and what's happening to their numbers. Because none of the last studies were done are about 10 years old now, and they're just starting to have a new round of studies. But I had a lot of conversations with the chief scientist at the Department of Environment and bird expert to try and get some of the facts straight. Because even when we visited Barranguga Montague, we couldn't really find out much about their life cycle there. Another example, there are plenty of rare and breeding birds that visit these islands, and many travel many thousands of miles back to the same island every year. This is the white-faced storm petrel, which is the smallest burrowing seabird in New South Wales. It weighs only about 50 grams, and it travels up to 6,000 kilometres every year from the eastern Pacific to come back to the same island. And it always chooses an island that are free of predators and human interaction, such as Balawa Island, which is near Borley Point, which I bet you that's an island you've probably never heard of. Very few people know that, it just flies under the radar. Now some islands are pretty boring. They're just rocks, like that one. That's O'Hara's Island, and this one is Dawson, one of the 2 Dawson's Islands. Now these are in the ocean adjacent to Mount Durras, just down from Pretty Beach, between Pretty Beach and Pemberley Beach. But even though they're pretty boring, they qualify because they're actually designated as an island. However, just south of there's another island called Flat Rock Island. Now, why it gets called an island when other rocks don't get called an island, I don't quite know. So there's a granite rock at Durras, a preservation rock at Narrawali, and a black rock just south of Batemans Bay. But this flat rock, which is literally just a flat rock, gets called an island. But who gave it that moniker and when, we don't know. Now that's another reason why our numbers kept varying, because granite rock appeared on our list when I used to say there's 62 islands, until I discovered that Mike had just snuck it in because he wanted to write about granite. I told you he was a geology freak. So at going power. I said, no, it's coming out. So while these don't have a lot going for it in terms of looks, well, in contrast, here's a photo of Baron River Montague. And just in case you're wondering about the name, it's been officially changed to the Aboriginal name, followed by the European name, so it is now officially known as Baron River Montague. And it's obviously the jewel in the crown of our 61 islands. It's the only one that has a high visitation, tourism visitation, organised trips in various ways, and is extensively documented. And because of that, I'm not going to say a lot about it today, but it is a magic place to visit. We spent 2 nights there, and it wasn't enough. I mean, if anybody wants a wonderful experience immersed in nature, I'd really recommend a trip. You can do day trips there, you can go snorkeling with the seals out there for the day, or you can stay overnight in the lighthouse keepers' cottages. And I won't talk about that a little bit later. So, some of the coastal islands, I said that the rest of them were all quite close to the mainland, and a handful of them are connected tidally to the mainland. So this is Green Island, same island that appears on the cover of the book. And these 6 or 7 islands are connected by what's known as a tombola. It's a sandy or rocky split that gets covered at high tide and gets uncovered at low tide or low swell. And so you can get across to them at certain times in most days, but not always, because people have drowned going to some of them where there's a high swell. So Green Island is just off the entrance to Lake Conjola. Then there are also 2 islands that are permanently connected. So they're still called islands. Crookhaven Heads, which you might be familiar with. You can see that there has an almost permanent rocky connection that has been probably connected for millenniums. But then Browley, which is the other, go backwards, yeah. But Browley, which is the other connected island, you can see that tombola there is pretty well vegetated. There's been a history of it being connected and disconnected in living in European memory. It looks as though it's really permanently connected now, but scientists do speculate that it could probably be breached at some time in the future. And this Browley is the only other island along the Baron River Montague that's extensively documented with quite a bit of interesting history. So that's a brief rendition of the coastal islands. And then there's the estuarine islands. That's the islands. We decided to include them because I like leading paddles. So the other islands we walked to or walked past, we aren't sea kayakers, so we didn't kayak around those. But the estuarine islands, we paddled around all of them, and there are 41 of those. And so they're the islands in the lakes and the lagoons and the rivers that are attached to the ocean, and we wanted to include the kayaking trips. The estuarine islands are arguably even lesser known and documented than the coastal islands. There are, as I said, 41 of them, but there are many more unnamed islands. So that's the entrance to Lake Conjola, and several of those islands are unnamed, and 3 of them are named. So only the 3 that are named get written about in the book. And another example is the Clyde River. And in the Clyde River there are 4 islands. Now each one of these islands also have very significant biodiversity values, not so much for protecting migrating birds, but in general as refuges for birds and other wildlife from disturbance and predation. But more particularly, most of them are surrounded by mangroves or seagrass beds or salt marsh, and these are vital to the health of the estuaries and to the health of the fishing, success of the fishing industry and the oyster industries where they exist. So this is Little Island, imaginatively named, because there's another one called Big Island in the Clyde River. And then there's one called Pelican Island, which I'll come on to in a minute. Even the locals don't seem to know that Pelican Island exists, because if you paddle past it on the main bit of the river over this side, it just looks as though it's all part of the mainland because of the mangroves. It's only when you get an aerial photograph like that you can see that it's really island. Most owners didn't even realise it's an island. A lot of the oyster farmers I spoke to said, "What's Pelican Island? Where is it?" And they run their oyster industry right around it. Then there's a Bud Island, which is the centre of the oyster industry. And nobody's quite sure who Mr. Budd was, so I'll come on to talking about the naming of islands afterwards, but Mr. Budd remains a bit of a mystery man. There's a Ryan's Island in a tributary of the Clyde, the Buckenbower River, and it's one of the 5 privately owned islands that we came across. It's been privately owned for centuries. It appears on the early parish maps. It was owned by Mr. Ryan, who was the son of a convict, and it has a very interesting early history related to the convicts and what happened to the convicts after they got their tickets of leave and started to settle, which was quite a lot around this Nelligan area and around the Batemans Bay area. But I actually spent months, it was one of my rabbit holes that I spent months down trying to work out who owned Ryan Island today, because I knew it was privately owned, and I just couldn't find out, and I couldn't find out. And one day I was so frustrated, I thought, I'm just going to get in the car, and I'm just going to drive up that twisty-turvy road that runs between Murgo and Nelligan, and I'm just going to see if I can see the island and maybe the property that's adjacent to it. And only I did. It was marked Runnymede, and I knew there was an association with Runnymede and history of the area and the convict history. So I let myself in through the gate and I walked down towards the river where I could see the island, and there were a lot of little outhouses and sheds, and I kept calling out, hello, is anybody at home? I'm a trespasser. I know, I'm sorry, I'm here. And then suddenly someone appeared from the house and said, hello, what are you doing here? And I said, look, I know I'm trespassing, but I've got a good reason. I said, I am actually doing some research on islands. And they said, you must be Helen Moody. I said, yeah, we heard that there was a lady called Helen that was doing research on islands. Yeah, we own the island. And they gave me the original title deed to the island. And so, it was one of my eureka moments. I'm going to tell you about a few other eureka moments as I went along. So that's that one. Now, so that's Pelican Island. So it's just mangroves. Now, a lot of islands are just mangroves, both named and unnamed, but there are actually only 2 in our book that are actually named Mangrove Island, and that's one in the Crookhaven River and one far down south in Pambula Lake. And mangroves feature very often in the book. They're ecologically vital to the health of the estuaries, also to the stability of the island's banks and the prevention of the silting up of waterways. So, people used to think in the olden days, that mangroves were just smelly areas, but they're actually very important for breeding for fish and crustaceans. They're very important. Likewise, this is Honeysuckle Island, which doesn't have a lot going for it. It's in Lake Walliga, down the far south coast. Not a lot you can say about it. You can't even circumnavigate it because it's so shallow around it, unless the estuary is open to the ocean, which is not very often down there. But the surrounding salt marsh, which again, it's all that brown stuff that I wish I could show you with a pointer, but I can't. And salt marsh plays a very vital role in the lake's ecology. And salt marsh is in decline in many places, and islands are havens for salt marsh. So, again, there's another ecological impact for islands. I mentioned before that there were 5 islands that are privately owned. One of them, Horse Island in Lake Turos, so that you might visit it if you've been a member of a garden club here, has one of the finest native gardens in Australia. And there's just a couple of pictures of the island, of the garden on Horse Island. The owner of it, Christina Kennedy, does invite particularly Australian Plant Society groups to visit the island, and occasionally garden clubs. I think we were her first kayaking group that came. I think she quite liked that. She thought that was a bit novel. So obviously, I can't talk about every island we visited, so I'm going to just focus on a couple of the islands, or a few of the islands nearest to Berry. And of course that takes us to the Shoalhaven River, or the Shoalhaven and the Crookhaven Delta. Now again, if I wish I had, so here we're looking at this end is the Shoalhaven Heads, which you can see at this stage it's open, which it often isn't. It's often just a big sandbar like it is at the moment. and then you can see the beginning of Comoron Island. So the islands near to Berry in this area, obviously closely associated with the history of Alexander Berry and his arrival. And some of you might know quite a lot about that, some of you might not, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about it anyhow. Are there any local history buffs in the room? Any local historians or people really interested in history? No, so it might all be new to some of you. Okay. So Alexander Berry arrived at the entrance to the Shoalhaven River, that's that area there, in January 1822. Now, a line of breakers at that entrance prevented him from entering the river. So he sailed south to enter by the Crookhaven River, which is probably just at the edge, where my pointer was going, at the right-hand edge of that picture. So he entered by the Crookhaven River, and then when he came back in June to settle the area, he again had trouble at the heads, and two of his crew drowned when they attempted to enter the Shoalhaven River. So the party again headed to the Crookhaven River, and they couldn't get their boat across the sand spit between the two rivers. Now that sand spit, see where the boats are? And I'm pointing at it as if I was the pointer. And just beyond that would have been that sand spit, beyond where the boats are would have been the sand spit. And so Berry left Hamilton Hume and 3 convicts on an isthmus there to build a hut and to cut a passage across the sand spit. And that passage is what is now known as Berry's Canal, and it linked the Shoalhaven and the Crookhaven rivers. And history will tell you that that created Comoron Island and altered the flow of the Shoalhaven River, which now mostly enters the ocean through the Crookhaven heads, because this is usually silted up. However, enter Mike in his absence. Geologists argue that Comoron was always an island, and that the canal was just a silted up natural waterway. So when you read that Berry created Comoron Island, or the canal did, not necessarily true. So, Pig Island. Pig Island in the Shoalhaven River is the large island that you can see when you're crossing the river. It's one of the 5 islands that are privately owned, and has been owned from the time of Berry, who drew a map in the 1827, which they believe is drawn by Berry, and it shows it was his property. Now, obviously, in nearly 2 centuries, it's changed hands a couple of times. It received its name when a farmer released pigs on the island, but they perished because they were all bitten by ticks. Now, every time Pig Island comes on the market for sale in modern times, it gets talked about as Baraga Island. Have any of you heard that term? So, if you see advertisements for it, it talks about Baraga Island. Now, it probably sounds better than Pig Island when you're trying to market it, especially to Chinese people, which mostly they're trying to market it to. But although historians talk about calling Baraga Island, and Baraga is an Aboriginal word that means bitter water, bitter swamp water, I could find absolutely no evidence that it was ever named that. And when I asked local historians what their source was, they can't tell me their source. So I think, what I came across quite often is one person repeated another person's sometimes mistakes or assertions that didn't have evidence, and that's what a lot of this book is about, is clearing up some sort of mixed messages that have happened. But anyway, I could tell you a lot more about Pig Island. I wish I had more books to tell you that if you're interested in the islands of the Shoalhaven River, you can buy them, but as I said, I'm just about out of books. And maybe here I should mention that if anybody does want to read more and doesn't score a book today, I know there is one in each of the Shoalhaven libraries, a copy of the book. So it is in the Nowra Library, and Hazel has bought a book that will go to the museum, the Berry Museum. So there will be a book there. Okay, so let me tell you something else about Pig Island before we go on. It was bought in about 2011 to an Australian Stock Exchange listed Chinese Australian investment company. Now, it has a bit of a history of having these incredible DAs passed by local council for all sorts of tourism activities. And I would imagine that it was bought in 2011 for an enormous sum of money because this company thought they were going to develop it. But it's not that easy to develop, and then they tried to sell it again in 2019 and again at the end of last year. And at the end of last year, the advertisements that appeared in newspapers, again probably directed to the Chinese, read as follows: "The freehold land is primed for multiple uses. The RU1 primary production zoning means potential uses include outdoor recreational facilities, an ecotourism sky view pod resort," whatever that is, "an 18-hole golf course, or an inland aqua park theme." That to me would seem to be stretching the interpretation of the zoning regulation somewhat, and also largely improbable, given it's pretty prone to flooding. So this has happened twice in the last 2 years. So buyer beware. Okay. So it was this area of the Shoalhaven and Crookhaven rivers that we began our exploration. So just off of the history a little bit, and a little bit about exploration. From the moment we started, I was somewhat obsessed with wanting to land on many islands, as many islands as we could. Mike wasn't, just wanted to finish the paddle, tick it off. But, so this is Regatta Island that I pointed out beforehand. This was our first landing. I was pretty excited at this. But anyway, so this area of the Shoalhaven, the Crookhaven River, is an area full of history, most of it related to the land holdings and the shipping interests of Berry and his cronies. And it's a good chapter to read if you're interested in history, but it's equally significant for bird watchers. So, all right, just before we go to the bird watchers, I mentioned one island before that we only discovered late, and this is Legs Island. Now, Legs Island, the other islands in the Shoalhaven River are downriver from the bridge towards the ocean. Legs Island is actually in the Shoalhaven River, upstream about, probably about 15 kilometres, and it's one of my favourite islands. And it happens to be the only island in all of our 61 that we know why it was named, that we could land on it, and that we could circumnavigate it. So I probably don't have time to tell you why it was named, but I'll tell you very briefly. It was named after a surveyor who was a very popular young man who was killed crossing the river on a horse. And they named the island after him. In the book I have a beautiful picture of that was painted of the island in 1858 or something like that, which was sort of not long after he died. And then I have a picture of me visiting the island, so it's visiting the island then and visiting the island now. So I really like that little island, and it's very pretty, and it's a beautiful paddle up the Shoalhaven River through the gorge and everything to get to it. So the other significant thing about the Shoalhaven River is the bird life. The sandy shores and the mud flats and the islands of the Delta region make it one of the five most important shorebird estuaries in New South Wales. It's a feeding area for both migratory and resident shorebirds, and also common water birds as well. Many migratory shorebirds gather and flock here in early autumn, specifically on Comoros Island, and they get their breeding feathers, and then they get their sort of flying feathers, and lots of bird watchers go there at that time of the year. So that's the Shoalhaven River. Now this is the Crookhaven River. Now I don't know if I can't go back to that original thing, and I didn't have the pointer. But the original map that I showed you had none of these islands named. That's so. And that one vast area actually consists of 3 islands there, where you can see them pointing down. But no map names them correctly. No map at all, other than 6 maps. Names them correctly, so I always tell kayakers beware. Actually, the only one that does name them, and some of you might be familiar with the Craigie's Narrow maps. It is the only map that names all those islands correctly, which was really interesting. So the river and the island, the Crookhaven River and the islands have been a food source for Aboriginal people for millenniums, well before the arrival of European settlement. It was known by the Aboriginal people as Geringer, and the traditional owners are the Geringer people. Radiocarbon dating tells us that they, Oysters have been a food source for 6,000 years, but there's no actual archaeological evidence that any of the islands were particularly significant. But once Berry arrived, well, there wasn't too much space left for however the Aboriginal people wanted to use it. Berry arrived in the district with a land grant of 10,000 acres. That's 100 acres for each one of the 100 convicts he had when he arrived. And that grew to 40,000 acres by 1863. He and his tenants monopolised all the land around the two rivers, clearing it of the cedar and growing crops. So from about 1840, Berry turned his attention to boat building and coastal shipping to carry the timber, the wheat, the dairy produce and all the other crops to Sydney. So Greenwell Point became the district's major port, and Berry controlled all the islands in order to prevent anybody else setting up shipyards or jetties there. So, and in those islands, one of them, Goodnight Island, is our other privately owned island. It has a particularly interesting history in about the 1920s, when it was run as a guest house that accommodated 46 people. And they used to have weekend parties and fancy guest balls and formal balls and it used to appear in the local paper who went and what was said and what was done. It was a source of much interest locally. It too is owned privately now by a developer that had plans to do a $25 million tourism project there at Greenwell Point, which has never come to fruition. It just sits there feeling somewhat abandoned. He never even comes. I actually found somebody on the island mowing the lawn when I paddled there a few weeks ago, and I talked to him for quite a long time to see what he knew about the island, and he said, it just never comes. So must have a lot of money to own an island that you don't visit. Okay, so paddling around there, you can see all those little creeks and things in the islands, and it's a great fun day's paddle. And here, I just love this photograph. It won't mean anything very much to you, but it's quite exciting for paddlers, because here we're in a creek where with our paddles we can touch 3 islands at the same time. So there's one island on the right, one island on the left, and another island straight in front of us. So that's just a little aside. I'm going to talk a little bit about discovering and naming the islands. Now, my obsession, of course, was always who named the islands, when and why. And I wasn't able to get all the answers. A considerable section of the book focuses on the historical context of discovering the islands, by Europeans discovering the islands, and the exploration of the south coast, and the challenge of either of establishing or failing to establish who named each island. I've got a little time to tell you about this, but just before I do, I should just tell you as an aside a couple of other things. So when I first started the project, I had an obsession with doing them all strictly in north-south order. I had to abandon that because of COVID, bushfires, potholes in roads, closure of national parks, and that was also why it took 4.5 years. When we had said originally, let's do them all north-south order, we thought, well, maybe a year and a half or 18 months of Sunday walks, or 2 years of Sunday walks and paddles, and we'd get it done. But it took nearly 4.5 years before we did. And we in fact only did the final trip, which we put on the program, our walks program, 5 times before we were actually able to do it. And I was halfway through writing the book at that stage. So so now back to who named the islands and when. Well, the first thing we know about any island's names is that James Cook named Montague Island Cape Dromedary in 1770 when he was sailing up the coast, mistakenly believing it was part of the mainland. And then in 1790, Nicholas Anstice, captain of the convict ship Surprise, which was part of the Second Fleet, established that it was an island, and he named it Montague, with no E on the end, after George Montague Dunk, the Earl of Halifax, whoever he might have been, but that's who it was named afterwards. Then, that was 1790, but unaware of this, In February 1798, Matthew Flinders named it Seal Island for obvious reasons when he sailed past it, because there were seals then and there are seals now. In October that year, when he sailed back again, he'd obviously found out that it had been previously named, so he renamed it Montague, but this time he added an E. So go figure how and why. So that's 1798. Then not much happened for a long time until 1821, when Governor Macquarie sent Lieutenant Robert Johnson, master of a snapper, down to do a recce of the Bateman's Bay area. So Johnson named the Clyde River after the river in Glasgow, which is where he came from, and he named Snapper Island, which sits in the mouth of the river, after his boat. Because explorers did tend to name things after their boats. Now, when he did this, he had Alexander Berry and Hamilton Hugh on board his boat with Thomas Davidson, and they made the first recorded ascent of Pigeon House Mountain. And it was Davidson who was one of the two people that got drowned when Berry tried to enter the river, I told you before, in the Snapper, when he was coming down here to settle. So that's an interesting historical connection. So that was 1821 that Johnston went down to Bateman's Bay. Once Berry then started the movement of free settlers southward from Sydney and discovered fertile land, there was obviously increasing demand for discovering new farming land on the south coast. So surveyor, in 1827, surveyor Robert Hoddle explored the area around Bateman's Bay. You might know Hoddle's name, he was the person that designed Melbourne. And in 1828, Thomas Florence, who looms very large in my book, he was sent to do the first ever trigonometric survey of the south coast from Jervis Bay to beyond Brownie Island, paving the way for the expansion of the colony southwards. Now, I want to tell you about a eureka moment that I had. So, when I was one of the problems is that historians tend to value explorers, but they don't tend to have any great regard for surveyors. So that there hasn't been a lot written about the surveyors who surveyed Australia, and they tend to be underdocumented. And this is one of the reasons that my information sources are so severely limited. And I spent a lot of time going to the State Archives office, which is out in the middle of Walk from Sydney. It's out in western Sydney. It's almost in a field. Finding the way there is really difficult. Once upon a time it used to be in Macquarie Street, but it's now way up there. And it's really difficult when you get there because you're only allowed to take a pencil in and paper and no pen and no water, no nothing. And there's not a lot of staff on, and the day I first went there for the first visit, it was quite busy, and I could see that the person who was meant to be the helpful person was loving helping people if they were researching wills, probate or divorces. But he wasn't terribly interested in surveyors. He didn't know a lot about it and trying to help me find my way around the filing system and those wretched microfiche machines and everything. And I got to one point where I couldn't find the information that I wanted, or I couldn't, and I really wanted to see. I was looking at Florence's field book on microfiche, and it wasn't very clear. There were 2 pages of writing which I thought might reveal something that I was trying to find, and I couldn't. So I asked this man, could I see the original? Oh, no, he said, you could only see the original if you're absolutely illegible. I said, well, this is illegible. And he said, no, too hard to get you out the original. And then I sort of observed that the staff changed around every couple of hours, and a rather nicer lady came on an hour later, and I asked her, could she get it for me? And she said yes. And I thought, I really got it out the back. But anyway, she brought out his original field document. Now I have to tell you, that's it. It was like a little notebook, no wider than my hand, it folded out, and there it has the whole of the coastline and the islands and everything and all things exactly as we know it today. And it was like, I was all gloved up touching this thing, and it was like all these months and years of research is worthwhile just because I'm touching this absolutely beautiful, original document that probably no more than a handful of people have ever handled in 2 centuries. So it was a bit of a eureka moment for me. So I was see people are getting restless. Should I be stopping quite soon or no? No, shaking head. All right. So I'll go on talking a little bit about names. So Florence was instructed by Major Mitchell, who was the chief surveyor, to use phonetically derived Aboriginal names for landscape features wherever possible. And he gave the names to many of the features on the coastline. Now again, I can't show you that, but it gives you the names of Bulweri for St George's Basin, and Maru, and Tabari, and Tamil, and Burial, and Browley, all with a lot of different phonetical layouts. And they all appear on his maps. But some of the names of some of the islands appear, like he called what's now known as Crampton Island, he called it Casual Island. And that was probably because he observed that sand spit that was sometimes made it an island and sometimes made it not an island, right? So there was a logic to that name, but he never provided an explanation for his names. And then he named what we now know as Grasshopper Island, which I showed you right at the beginning. He named it Platter Island. He gave no name to Brush Island, which is a well-known island which many people speculate that he called Mitt Island as an Aboriginal name, but there's absolutely no evidence that that's it. I mean, all the other Aboriginal names have double E's and double L's and double E's, and Mitt Island, there's no evidence that that even sounds like an Aboriginal name, and the Aboriginal woman that recently wrote the dictionary says there's no hard T in the language. I speculate, that the word Mitt appears in his field book as a bearing. I speculate, and I can't prove this, that he was probably going to name the island Mitchell. After all, Major Mitchell was his boss. But maybe it never happened because there was no name. See that island down the bottom? That is Brush Island now, and it wasn't called Mitt Island, or it wasn't called Brush Island on that map. So there's a mystery. So here we have, in 1824, 1828, we have the field books and the maps drawn up by Surveyor Thomas. And yet, only a few years later, in 1836, we have Major Mitchell's famous map of the colony of New South Wales, also known as the map of the 19 counties. And down here, just got to show you, this bit down the bottom where it's marked in blue, down the very bottom, that is actually the Shoalhaven coastline. It's a really peculiar angle, and here's a printout of it. Now here, only 6 years after Major Mitchell, after Florence came down, we have all the islands named with the names we know them today. And where did these names come from? There's a picture of it in the book. Where do they come from? We just don't know. Major Mitchell went back to England to draw his map. Maybe there was pressure from Queen Victoria or powers that be, to name this island after this person or that person. But there's no notes, there's nothing that can reveal why these islands are named. A few we name, we know that Wasp Island was named after Florence's boat, but most of them we still don't know. And after months and months and months of research, I actually wrote to the State Library, which owns the Mitchell collection, and said, can they do some research for me? And they did. They gave me an hour's research time and then emailed back, and I've got the quote in the book saying, we can see you've done heaps of research, and it's probably something you're going to have to accept that we'll never know who or why these islands were named by or after. So they remain a mystery, even though I've spent all this time writing a book about them. One of my frustrations. Now, have I got time just to mention a few more islands that we haven't talked about. Just, okay, you're happy for me to do that? Okay. All right. So we're back to Brawley again. And I just want to mention this. I mentioned it before in the context of it being more or less a permanently detached and being well documented. It has a very interesting early history. In the 1840s, it was the largest settlement south of Wollongong and an important shipping port. When I say it was the largest settlement, it had all of 46 people living on the island and around, and there's a picture of it. It had an inn on the island, and then down the bottom you can see it had some cow fences for the shipping to come in and take cows away or milk away. So that's a lovely historical picture of the island. And today it's a great place to go for a day trip. You can walk around the island, you can snorkel beside it, it's about a 4-kilometre walk around the island. Because of that sand spit, one side or the other is usually protected, so it's a great place to swim or snorkel or explore the basalt rock platform. So I just thought I'd mention that if any of you are looking for an interesting day trip to an island and you haven't been. Brawley's the place to go. It's not too far down the coast. About an hour's drive, an hour's drive from Ulladulla, so about 2 hours from here. Merriman Island in Wallaga Lake. It's one of my favourite islands because it's one of my favourite areas. It lies between the river and Bulagui, and it's an estuarine island of great significance to First Nations people. In 1977, it was the first Aboriginal place to be gazetted. And it's a lot of Aboriginal history attached to it. Obviously, I don't have time to tell you that history today, but you can see the island is shaped like a duck. Can you see that duck shape? And the island is called Umbara by the Aboriginal people after the black duck, which is their totem and protector of the Yuin people from the dreaming. Now, a Yuin man in about 1900 named Merriman had Umbara as his totem. And he lived on the island. And so there is an Aboriginal story that goes, when his people were in danger, Umbara warned them that they could take refuge on the island. And the book outlines a Dreamtime story that has various details depending on which source one uses. These all vary, and I've tried to sort of, with some of these Dreamtime stories, take elements from all the stories and put it together to try and represent the various versions. It is one of my favourite islands, largely because I love the surrounding scenery of lakes and ocean and forest. And there's Gulaga, the mother mountain, Mount Dromedary, overlooking, with her brooding look, overlooking the lake. And here's Gulaga again, but this is taken from Barranguba Montague. So there is another Dreamtime story that connects Gulaga, the mother mountain, with Barranguba, which was her eldest son in the Dreamtime story. And there's said to be a crystal reef of water that still connects the two. And again, the story varies with the telling. And all right, just two more. Okay, so now one last island. This is Leonard's Island. This is almost to the Victorian border. And you might have thought that after 5 years of exploration and visiting islands, we were island out. But we took one look at this island and its gorgeous red rocks, which comes from the iron oxide in it. But you would have thought we were out, but it's so beautiful. It's so isolated and it's so beautiful. You have to walk for a few hours to get to it. And it's a magical place. So that, and again, you can just see down the bottom right-hand corner, it is connected to the mainland via Tombola. And that was the end of our island odyssey. But I haven't quite finished the story because I'm going to tell you one more story today. So it relates to our visit to Barranguba. And so before I took the group to Barranguba for a couple of nights, I did a bit of research about the lighthouse keepers and the history of the island. And one of the things I discovered was the interesting stories I discovered was that there was one period, about quite a number of years, where the head lighthouse keeper didn't speak to the assistant lighthouse keeper. And the only way they ever communicated was by telephone in the two cottages at night time. So go figure. So nowadays those two cottages have been done up beautifully, and you can stay in them with all beautiful Georgian furniture, and it's a really beautiful place to stay. And we're in one of them. We're in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, the main one, and hanging on the wall in the hallway is an old Bakelite phone, which all of you will be familiar with. And we had an evening of parlour games, and that's very appropriate because it was the parlour we were sitting in. And as we were getting up to go to bed, about 9:30, 10 o'clock, and it's dead silent, you know, we're 9 metres offshore, there's only the sound of crashing waves, and the phone rings. It goes ring, 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 I kid you not. And I pick it up and I say, hello, hello. Now, you know, if you've ever used a phone like that, you'll know that there's always some sort of background noise, the whir of the operator or the whir of, you know, the ringing of the wiring system or whatever, but there's dead silence. Hello, who is it? Dead silence. So I hang up. And the next morning I said to the voluntary guide that was on there, who I happened to know from my past life, I said, because the volunteer guides live in a little place, and I said, did you ring us? I said, I thought we were told there was no phone reception out here, that we couldn't even use our mobile phones. Did you ring us last night on the phone? And he looked as if I was off my head. And he said, what do you mean ring you? I said, so the phone rang. He said, oh, don't be silly. How much did you drink? I said, whatever, all right. He said, those phones haven't worked for decades. So there's a mystery. I'll finish with that. Thank you for listening to me today.